hands that minister to their needs so that they could soon return to our work and worship together. Father, we ask all these things in your Son's name with the hope that you will forgive us of our sins. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, from where we left off last week, we were considering about some of the challenges that we can have as God's people, and in particularly the various differences that we have. And not only our desire to be together and to be alike and to work together as a body, which is kind of an interesting metaphor. The vernacular now in most of the business world is about teams. And I guess team sports may not have been invented by the first century. Maybe in North America they were playing jai-alai or something like that, or whatever some of the indigenous people games that they had that were maybe team sports. But I don't know that that team sports had been invented. And the idea of working together as a group, they knew about the technology about ganging animals together to do a difficult task, although the technology they had to do that didn't advance until much later. But they had this idea of teams, but that's not what's really being talked about here. And I find that kind of interesting, not only that it hadn't been invented yet, but it is a different concept. With teams, you can have stars. You can have people that will outperform the rest of the team, and regardless of how one team is doing, they can be basically doing their own thing, usually disastrously. You can see that when you see teams that normally play well together decide to stop and each just try to carry the team on their own shoulders. Usually it ends up with a loss or something, a very disastrous performance. But for the body, your eyes or your ears or your hands or your feet or your knees don't have other career paths. Right? There's no other opportunities outside of the one that they're knit into. And so being members of one body, being recognition of that no matter what your aspirations are, your highest aspiration is to perform well as a member of the body, really. That you shouldn't have career plans on going on to become an eye surgeon or something like that, or the hand's going to break away from the body and go and do its own thing. When that happens in a physical body, we recognize it's a sign of disease. It's a design of a problem, isn't it? And I think that the use of the body is not only convenient because everyone knows what a body is. Everybody reading the scriptures would recognize how a body would work together and the importance that it work together, and they all be fit to their purpose and perform the purposes that they've been designed to do. We understand the necessity of that. In fact, we can really recognize no alternatives. And so, whether your hand likes being attached to the rest of you, it really doesn't have a whole lot more choice. It's not like it's going to strike out and do something else. And so, this reminder about these reminders that we have to get along, to bear one another's burdens, to be considerate of each other and such, are useful to us in thinking about the context of a body. And I've come to appreciate that more as we've gone, I guess, now 6 weeks or so into this study. At the top of page 29, we were talking about some of the struggles. We talked about some of the political struggles, some of the background struggles that the Corinthian church, early church, would face with its mixture of converts, some Jews, some Gentiles, some slaves, some free, some pagans, and some believer proselytes, former, always thought of themselves as being the people of God. But then it also, the author turns us to young and old. And so what are the challenges? What comes to mind when I say that you've got young and old in the congregation? What comes to mind? What do you think of? Cynthia.
Levels of maturity and expectations of stereotypes of what you think young people are like and what you think old people are like.
Okay. There's this levels of maturity, and that could be the physical maturity, just the life experiences that a person has had versus one end of the spectrum versus the other. There's not only, I said physical and spiritual maturity, but there's also this tendency to think in stereotypes. The old people, all they got to look forward to is going from being old to being old and in the way. And the young people basically not having a clue about how the world works. And those stereotypes are very easy, and the world almost encourages us to embrace them. Cody? Sure.
And those experiences that older people come by bring wisdom. And
hopefully.
Those young people are mature enough to see
And there's a tendency to even think about them in as blocks. It's by virtue of the fact that the big head start that the older folks have, that they're automatically more knowledgeable and wiser. And in some cases, they may not have been paying attention very well, and they may not have been very wise to begin with. And, just never really got a good head start on that. So that assumption may fall through. Likewise, there's some young people that will surprise you with the depth of their thinking. Todd? So the means of communication, the state of technologies in their lives, there's a lot of things that can produce a friction, produce rubs there between the people on each end of the age scale. Mike?
I think when you actually get older, you become more set in your ways, so how you tackle situations is different in and of itself.
And there's with the age comes cruft, some settling in. It can get that way, and that can be. You can jump into a stereotype that basically the young people want it to be different just because they want it to be different, and the old people just don't want to face any change. They like things the way they are and are struggling to keep things the way they are, and that's a stereotype that we can fall into. And these differences produce the opportunity for friction. Well, what do the scriptures advise with this regard? What advice in particular did Paul give Timothy? Does anyone recall? Don't let anyone despise your youth, as some translation. But don't discount you. Don't let the fact that you are younger discount the fact that you are in fact an agent of the Spirit. You know the gifts that you've been given. You know the tasks that you've been given as an evangelist. And don't let anyone marginalize you because they recognize that you're younger than them. And that's a very real possibility. That's a distinct possibility because, again, this tendency maybe to fall into these stereotypes. There is this tendency that we need to be considerate of each other, even on those ends of the age spectrum, right? And really the model that I think we should have is recognizing that we have some young people and some older people, in between people, and then some old people, but what do they all have in common? Christ died for them. That's an excellent thing to remember, but they are people. And that ought to be the lens that we focus on first and foremost. Is an appreciation for these Christians, no matter what their life experiences are, whether they're a new convert, generally speaking, you'll find younger people that are newer converts, right? Generally, it's a rule of thumb. But it's possible that there are some older people that are converted to Christ late in their life. And they, in fact, are new converts and are going through those new convert experiences just like the teenagers. And we don't always keep that in mind. We just automatically assume that we find out someone's a Christian and we see the topping, we see the color of their hair, and we assume that they've been Christians for decades. And that's not a safe assumption. And the danger that we have in making those assumptions as we're evaluating our relationships together is we need to start with these are all people that Cynthia reminds us and the scriptures remind us that God welcomed, that God sent his son for. And we ought to always start at that place and then let the relationship grow from there. Another problem with these assumptions, I got to watch my time here, I'll rant too long. Another problem with these assumptions is that we start putting what we think, or the visual, the superficial impressions that we get, in the place of actual knowledge about that person. And that's always going to produce, at best, it may not be a completely wrong picture, but it will be an incomplete picture. Guaranteed. When all you see is the age of the person, and you've decided then about the caliber of their spirituality, the caliber of their group, of their their outlook on life, their collection of life experiences, if you form your whole opinion about that without ever actually having a conversation with that person, you have drawn, at best, an incomplete conclusion. And you just have to expect that. This isn't rocket science. I mean, I don't have to point to a book, chapter, and verse. It didn't have to be delivered. This is a human observation. That until we ask questions and get to know the person in question, we don't know them. And if we start making up our mind about them without actually talking to them first, you are losing the relationship game. You are losing, and you're behind, and you'll stay behind until you make broker that introduction and actually talk to people about what it is they think and see. Michael? Absolutely.
Projecting how their faith is weak and maybe your faith is weak, and it becomes almost like an anger thing. You know what I mean?
It certainly can. That your projections about how you feel about things that you extrapolate and lay over this other person, whether they're young or old, is probably going to be flawed. It's almost guaranteed that person that you're considering is going to be at a different place spiritually than you are, because they haven't walked in your shoes. They're not as old as you are. They don't have the same experience. They haven't traced the same path that you did. It's true that older folks have had a longer time to be able to become familiar with the Scriptures. And so as a rule, an older Christian might have a deeper knowledge of the Scriptures. And that's, you've seen that demonstrated in class. And I'm not talking about me as an example. I'm talking about the comments that are offered from the people in the class that represent the fact that they've been reading and studying and meditating on the Scriptures longer than the folks who maybe sit up here in the front row. And that's for the benefit of the folks that don't attend here regularly. That's where our teens like to congregate, our younger Christians like to congregate. And it's not just your choice of whether you're front of the auditorium or back of the auditorium. It's a matter of making a different set of collective decisions based on what their life experiences have brought them to. And we have to have a full appreciation of that if we're going to be considerate of each other and avoid this unnecessary friction. There's no scriptural basis for this kind of friction, is there? There is in fact a lot given to the younger Christians giving honor to older Christians, and the older Christians being honor bound to teach the younger Christians what they know. But until you start brokering a relationship, until you begin those conversations, you're not going to be effective at either one of those spectrums, are you? And the onus just isn't on the young folks to get to know the older folks in the crowd. It flips around the other way as well. That if you've already made up your mind about the folks that are sitting on the different ends of the auditorium for you, based on what looks to be the way their age, their hairstyle, their dress, you've made an error. You've exceeded what the Scriptures have really allowed you to do, in my opinion. Jerry? Sure. Absolutely. That's maybe a textbook example. There are others that we could look at, but certainly Goliath despised David when he first saw him. And he didn't think that David was a formidable opponent at all. Of course, he didn't know about David's experience with the lion and the bear, and the fact that he fully enjoyed the Spirit of God helping with him. And he didn't realize what a formidable foe that David represents, just because he snapped judgment that he made on appearances. So don't do that, right? The Scriptures are filled with things about, not just things you should do, but things you should not do. So there's several things here that we just need to be aware of in our relationships. And the obligation that we have as members of the body to work together isn't age dependent. At least I don't see anything in the Scriptures that leads me to believe that. And so we shouldn't draw on that either. And I've got to shift gears and get into the next lesson if we hope to give it any justice today. Thank you for your comments, and I think those observations are valuable, and Leslie specifically wanted us to visit them some. Lesson number 7, that looks like page 31, has this unique picture. It starts out talking about the sequoia trees, and it's interesting. You may think they grow so big, they're so hard to knock down. They're not impossible. The elements sometimes do get the better of them. And some of it is because of their size, and even talks about how thick their bark is and such. But the thing that's not apparent to us until you actually dig around, do some studying, is the fact that they also exist in clumps and intertangle their roots for stability. That their roots they're not strong because their roots run deep, and these tap roots run deep into the earth that anchor them, but rather their roots are relatively shallow, and they are intermingled with the trees that are around them. And that makes the group, the forest, the pocket of sequoias more resistant to being knocked down. Now, of course, I don't know if it helps them for every disaster. I don't know if it helps them in an earthquake or fire, but in terms of the wind and elements trying to knock them down, that makes them more resilient. And that's a model here that, again, it's not strictly speaking, I can't point you to a scriptural instance of that, but it's a pretty good model of thinking about our relationships together. I like that. I like this idea because it, again, encourages us, it puts the onus on us to develop those interconnections. They're not automatic. Just by coming and sitting in this building, you're not automatically going to get connected to the people that are in here. We might like to think so sometimes. We like to think maybe there's things that you may have admired about this group and say, you know, I want to develop in that fashion, or I want to be like that, or I like that influence and I want to get more of it. There may be some things about that that attract you to God's people when you have encountered them. But just being attracted to it and just sitting amongst it isn't sufficient. You're actually going to have to dig in and expend some personal capital, take some risks, and develop the relationships if you hope to enjoy the benefits of that resilience, of being rooted together and being stronger on that account. That's, again, putting us in the driver's seat, isn't it? It's not you don't automatically become connected to people. Sometimes it's some people are more naturally connected. You've encountered that through your schoolmates, your people that you've worked with, your neighbors, that you just hit it off with, right? Connecting with them is relatively easy. But even then, without serious work, you can have a very superficial relationship. You could be connected because your love of racing. But the race only comes to town a couple of times a year, right? And if that's all that you've got in common, that relationship might not advance very far. If, on the other hand, that you share your life experiences, particularly in looking at today's text in Galatians 6, you actually intertwine your life with them to help them with their burdens. Those relationships are going to become deeper and even more resilient. But you're going to have to spend some to make that gain. You're really rarely going to back into a relationship like that, just accidentally. Sometimes you meet up with people that are actually you're standing at the same place in line, or even you're witnesses to a car accident or something like that, and you're by the circumstances get the opportunity to become aware of each other, and then maybe decide to spend a little more time together, and you deepen that relationship. But at each layer, you're having to expend more of yourself. You're having to put yourself out there to be able to enjoy the benefits of these other relationships. The idea, well, let me ask. Let's read the scripture before we get too deeply into this. Leslie does a real good job with that, and I want to emulate his success here. Beginning in Galatians 6, reading through verses 1 through 5. Brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he is something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be he in himself alone, and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load. Consider. It starts with this very practical advice: is that those who have the means of helping others with spiritual problems should do so. Particularly if you are the more spiritual, or you are, in other passages like Romans 14:15, the stronger Christian. That you have the means, you have the capability, you have maybe more depth and experience and resources to be able to help those who are less fortunate. And they may be less fortunate because of their judgment, their wisdom, their spiritual maturity. They've found themselves in a difficulty, and the onus is on the stronger, more mature Christians to restore them, to bring them back to faith. And even then, and that may be you may think that that's kind of a natural response, but it's a normal human response. But I'm going to challenge that. When our minds go to idle, when our mental discipline, we drop out of the high gears in mental discipline and we go down to neutral. What do you think of? What do you find yourself thinking of, Cynthia? Your own self-interest. I can't I wish I could repeat that every other sentence here. That's our tendency. Even if you've been a Christian a long time. Even if you know a lot of scriptures. Your tendency as the animal part of us, the C.S. Lewis described us as amphibians. And we think of amphibians as slimy things, maybe, reptiles and the like. But the idea is that we live on the water and the land. We live in the world and in the spirit. And our tendency is for the meat machine, the physical part, the world part, to take over. Particularly if your mind is idled. If you're not exercising that discipline to remember the example that you ought to be with Jesus. You ought to be like Jesus. And not thinking, and when you're given the circumstances about what to say or do, what would Jesus want me to do? If you just left and you don't bring that thought to mind, your thoughts fall into, well, what do I want to do? And it's a rare person who naturally thinks ought to be helping somebody else out. Because ultimately, what do you get out of it? You might not get anything. And that, in nature, that doesn't make sense. That's a loss that you may never recover. In the life under the sun scale, right? Why would you expend yourself for someone else? After all, you're in competition with them. If you give them food or clothing, that's food or clothing that you don't get to use. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't pay the bills. There's no return on investment there. Right? Or am I just really hard-hearted in this? Am I overthinking this? Isn't that our natural tendency? Is it our natural tendency to bear one another's burdens? I don't think that it is. I think that we can get to a state in which that's our reflex, where we behave like that sooner or quicker because we're trying to be pleasing to God. And that's a mental discipline thing, isn't it? To be aware, first of all, be looking for those opportunities and to be aware of your responsibilities so that you are spurred to action. That takes effort. Why bother? What's in it for you? Cody?
It becomes the reaction when we have a relationship. But when you don't have a relationship with someone, it's not our first reaction to be like, I don't get anything out of that. But when you are friends with someone, or brothers and sisters with someone, all of a sudden it becomes, well, that's what I do.
Right. And that's the relationship that makes the difference. Now, if you can show kindness to strangers, that's legal and allowed and expected. That's a state of maturity, though. But generally, we find the reflex at hand much more simply or much more readily with people that we have in a relationship with, that we've already gotten some skin in the game, maybe some pounds, some investment in, to where we're actually thinking of them and thinking of their benefit as being our benefit together. And that's not the natural state. We can't lose sight of that. That's not the natural condition. Okay, all of this is affected behavior. We don't like to think of it that way. We'd like to think of ourselves as better, right? And indeed, God designed us. God intends for us to be purveyors of good works, following after the example of Jesus. If even Jesus' critics considered, yeah, that guy does a lot of good. Even those people that thought he did it by the power of demons conceded that, yeah, it may be by the power of demons, but he's helping a lot of people. He's doing a lot of good. That's the example that we have. We ought to be that way, and so we can't take that for granted. That takes a lot of mental discipline and purpose to be able to achieve. And as Cody said, it's a lot simpler for us. It's more within reach and more natural to us when the relationship exists. Now, does it matter who started the relationship? I can't see that it does. But the relationship is crucial. That without the relationship, I don't think that you're going to be motivated to bear one another's burdens. Will you? Todd?
Maybe even more important than a relationship, though, is effort on our part. Because maybe getting ahead of you. Verse again, talk about every opportunity that we have, we're supposed to try to do good. So if I'm practicing that in my life, I'm trying to do good. Relationships will come as a result of the effort and the prayer to God.
Okay. from verse 10 and that onus to do good in all that we can, that if we practice that and get better at that, that this may come more naturally. Even if it's not a big burden, but maybe especially if it's not a big burden. Again, the natural man will think, well, it's not going to cost me much. I can help this person, put the groceries in the car, and then I'm done with them, right? And so that's a small, that gives me a check mark as having borne somebody's burden for the day. And it didn't really cost me very much. So there's a tendency even for the physical thinking to lapse over into this very relational, very wide concern. This idea about putting yourself out for someone else's benefit. And that's what's the motivation for doing this, according to verse 2? We talked about in verse 1 that, there but for the grace of God go I. It may be that you'll need this kind of TLC sometime. You'll need this kind of concern. That you'll need this kind of, you'll be in exactly, the situations will be reversed. And that comes to mind, but as Cynthia's reminded us from verse 2, thank you, that in doing this and bearing one another's burden, it's not an optional behavior. This is an expected behavior because you're actually fulfilling the commands that Jesus issued to his disciples. This is your responsibility, whether it was your idea or not, whether you want to or not. This is part of the walk with God that it means to be Christ's disciple. Jesus, you call him Lord, right? In Luke 6 and verse 46, he says, why do you call me Lord when you don't follow my commandments? In that case, you're just giving somebody an honorific. It's a title like Mr. or Your Honor or something like that. If they're not actually your Lord, if Jesus isn't actually your Lord, you're not really doing him any favors by calling him that. But when he is your Lord and you have to accept his commandments as part of your relationship with him, then this is a commandment that fulfills the law of Christ. You'd think, well, that's not anything big or important, is it? It's not like taking a bullet for somebody or donating an organ to them or something. That's not something big. How can that fulfill the law of Christ? How can that make it be the make break, the differentiator between whether or not I'm a disciple or not? Well, Jesus also taught, your Lord also taught, that he that is faithful in little is faithful in much. And this is an illustration of that. If you can't muster yourself to have concern for your brothers around you, you've got a ways to go. Cynthia.
I think that all of us are pretty comfortable with the idea bear somebody else's burdens, help a weaker brother. But there are things that we really need to be able to overcome. One is if you see your brother with a spiritual burden or a physical or material burden, if we approach that person, they might be suffering from pride and saying, oh no, I got it handled, I don't need any help with anything. Or maybe they feel like we're judging them harshly. We're saying, you don't really have things under control. You need some help with this. A lot of times offers of help are rejected, and we have a fear of rejection. They say, when you're butting into my business, you're being very invasive or personal. And we have to not be afraid of rejection. We have to, keep saying, you can say we got it together, but, let's get together and talk about this. Really think things through. Those are the difficult things of parenting.
I really wish that you could see what I see. There's a lot of people that are unconsciously perhaps nodding, because they can hear what you're saying, and I'm going to try to rephrase it. But that takes, the onus to do this takes knowledge and awareness of this other person's burden, and it's fraught with all kinds of peril. You may misjudge the situation. They may misjudge your motives and reject your help because of pride. They may, in fact, not recognize their condition as even being one that needs help, which is going to be, that's going to be an early requirement to correcting the situation. Is the person receiving the correction has to recognize that there's a problem. We may have misjudged that. In our perception and our superficial knowledge of their situation, we may have come to the wrong conclusion and misjudged the situation entirely. There's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of things that Cynthia reminded us of here that make this sound like a simple command, but it takes a lot of maturity, a lot of wisdom, a lot of practice in being able to judge these situations and apply your efforts in a way that actually helps. And it is judgment that we're talking about, your personal judgment, which is going to be improved, back to a point that I made earlier, if in case I've ranted past it and you've forgotten it, that it requires the bedrock, the foundation of the relationship to begin with. If you don't know the walk of your brother or sister, you don't know that necessarily that you're treading on sensitive ground, or you may not make your offer in a way that helps them to receive it. And that makes it hard because that means we have to do the work beforehand, right? We have to do all the homework to have a hope of passing the exam. So you can't flip it around there. You can't just go right in and take the exam cold and then be surprised that you couldn't work the problems. Paul, and then Chris. That's true. I agree. In that relationship, again, that's another problem that we've got in bearing one another's burden is sometimes the physical side wants to jump up and say, make sure you get credit for this. Make sure that people know that you're doing this. Make sure that they know who's the one that's putting themselves out for their benefit. And there's no real basis for that. That's just, the help, the burden needs to be borne, and they need help bearing it, no matter who gets the credit, even if they get the credit for doing it all themselves. And that's acceptable. Not worrying about who's going to get in the credit. And that speaks to the motivation and the fact that even in the offering ourselves, we have to guard against pride. We have to guard against our misconceptions being as a force multiplier and coming and creating the wrong conclusions. Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I said earlier, it's hard in the worldview. The natural state of Darwinism, survival of the fittest. You're your own God, and the weaker one, or you look at yourself as higher position. You look at the media, the fake media out there, people try to figure out what is supposed to be, their idols and so forth. So you're fighting with the world. I think unless you're in a church or some sort of belief, maturity in God, that you're never going to survive in this world if you don't have a foundation. Because it's a very scary world out there.
Certainly, there's a lot of influences in the world, and even considering that, considering what we started with the young and old, is that the young people today, because of our society, have been forced into a fast track on some of their relationships and some of the things that they've had to cope with than we experienced when we came through on our watch. And the influences of the world and its media, and the fact that the media is seldom aligned to your motivations. You may find your motivations aligning them to what you see in social media, and that should be at least an amber light, if not a red light for you, because their motivations are not yours. They're not the social media is not designed as it's not motivated by a desire to be Christ-like. It's not. It's more than likely going to be the opposite. And be aware of the influence, the time that you spend in those corners, and the influence that has on your life is going to make an impact on how readily that you're going to be prepared to bear one another's burdens. Consider for a moment here the difference, or is there a difference? And your translation may also use the same word in verse 2 and in verse 5. The ESV inserts the word load. Each one shall have to bear his own load. And in verse 2, it's bear one another's burdens. What do you perceive as being the difference in that? Is this a contradiction? I see some shaking of the heads. It's not a contradiction, but what's the differences in these words? Cynthia?
Well, a load is something that you should be able to take care of yourself. It's not a huge thing. It's your individual responsibility. But a burden is something that is much heavier and that it's like almost impossible to deal with alone. That you do need support and help.
Or not everyone is able to bear in the same measure. That for a given person, the load might be a backpack. And if you saw someone coming in from the parking lot with a backpack, you probably wouldn't be, unless it's, obviously overstuffed and if they're cantered back, if they give you some body language, the backpack is filled with 80 pounds worth of ruck, that, you might not feel the need to intervene. But you saw someone struggling with a trunk, particularly if the trunk had two handles on it. Now, there's some people in the congregation, Daniel comes to mind, who may maybe be able to heft that up, or maybe even hop it up on one shoulder and carry it into the building. But most of us are going to be dragging it in the parking lot, probably. And so the ready appearance here, here's someone that needs help and an opportunity to help, and it's too heavy for them to carry. That's the thing that I think the scriptures, at least the author, called our attention, is the difference between a load and a burden. Eric?
That's scriptural, and I think it's the context here. So when we're bearing one another's burden, helping one another, that's not the same thing as being accountable for one another.
Yeah.
And we are accountable for our own selves, including how we treat one another, how we the work that we do for the world. That is our accountability. One larger concept I think here is that apparently there was some, not apparently, there was some fighting, devouring one another, jealousy. There was a way of treating one another that was fleshly. Paul is saying, and I think it's really what the word spiritual means, that we are walking by the Spirit. We talked about the natural man and the spiritual man. And in fact, we're flipping that on its head and seeing how we can help even those that are more mature.
That's an interesting observation. That if you look at the load, and that each one must bear his own load, does say accountability, but that suggests accountability. And in fact, that verse 2 may have been part of that accountability. Part of our load as Christians is to help other Christians bear their loads. Even if it's their load and they're supposed to be accountable for it, that even, when that load gets to be too large for them to bear, it becomes a burden. The backpack may just have straps on it. It may have been designed to be carried on the back, but it can be made too heavy to bear. And so that's that accountability, that responsibility, accountability is a way of, I think, marrying those up. They certainly, the point of the scriptures is not to beat the two passages together and see which is the strongest. They're both simultaneously to be applied. Tom?
Yeah, I think that in keeping more with the metaphor that Paul is using here, although the backpack and the case I think is a good metaphor, this is actually a nautical term, the idea of load. And being a nautical term, it's like a ship is carrying its load. Okay, so
Cargo.
you have the ship carrying the load. Well, there's its individual load. But then let's say there's a ship that hits the rocks, and everybody is bailing out, and they're losing all of their cargo and everything like that. Then this ship comes to rescue, to help out. And I think that that's a better metaphor in explaining the difference between burden and load, because the ship that's on the rocks has a burden, whereas the ship that's carrying its cargo has its own load.
And I think in that line of the cargo and the rescuing of the cargo of the partially impaired ship or a sinking ship is in addition to load. That the burden of someone else is in addition to your load. That may be his load. He or she may have taken that on themselves. They have created a situation that made put this burden in their life, but it's part of our load to help them with their burden. I think is a way of understanding these scriptures together. And this idea about rescue is completely, that's where we started out in verse 1. It's a rescue. Okay, you're not just deciding, well, you've got idle time on your hands, you ought to meddle in somebody else's life and get them straightened out. That's not the advice that Paul's giving here. He's saying, here's someone that's imperiled, and they need a restoration. They need to rescue. They need help. And if you're spiritual, you can get it in gear and help restore them. And that's I think, again, pushes these passages together. With the bell, I also want to jump ahead to another passage that was in the lesson, questions that are on page 33, and look at 1 John, the 3rd chapter, and verse 16. It's kind of interesting here that it's reading. It gives this passage and asks the question, which I'll pose to you after we read the passage: is Jesus, in fact, setting a new standard, or love, or how far should our love for our brother extend? 1 John 3:16. By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us not live in word or in talk, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and reassure our heart before him. So is this a new standard? Is this redefining the standard for love? Jesus' example? John says, he says that this is how we know love, that he laid down his life. What instances can you think of love prior to Jesus' sacrifice? What examples can you think of? It existed. Jesus didn't invent love. He did his love on earth. I think, though, that he did define a new standard, set the bar. It maybe not higher, but where it should have been all along. That emphasis on a demonstration of love for someone else's sole benefit, even at your expense, is certainly a high bar. But I think if you think about, and you think about Old Testament examples, you can probably think about instances not family, where love was demonstrated. David and Jonathan comes to mind first for me. That even though it wasn't in Jonathan's best interest to seek David's best interest, he did so. And even at the expense of the relationship with his family. Because of his love, his concern, his posture, his feelings toward David and David's benefit. And I think that Jesus demonstrates that, but exceeds it, doesn't he? Again, he sets the example, the gold standard. And it's not, it also begs the example that we might think, so, okay, yeah, if you had to be pushed out of the way to keep from being injured, I'd take that for you. Yeah, I'd take a bullet for you. Yeah, if it came down to it, you can count on me. I would take the bullet for you. But I'm not going to part from my stuff to feed you. How does that make sense? Remember that faithful in little and faithful in much? You got to start with the obtainable. And it may mean that you got to share your cornbread with your brother. Because you've got it, and it's good and tasty, just like your wife usually makes it. And it will benefit your brother, and even though you're looking forward to seconds and thirds, that you ought to share that with someone that needs it. And be willing and have the mindset that this is so good, who can I share it with? That's aligning yourself to what's a new bar. Being mindful of those opportunities and a recognition that what you've got, you ought to be willing to put at the benefit, especially of your brothers. And it may be that your measure and your capability of doing that may be the measure and capability of you as God's servant. And we don't often keep that thought in mind, I don't think. I'd love to get Cynthia's comment, but that's the bell. If you can hold it to next week and dump it on Leslie, I'll empower you. Thank you for your comments, your participation.